Some houses don't just witness madness. They feed on it. I grew up in a home that learned to breathe on its own. A place where footsteps echoed even when no one walked. Where shadows didn't follow the light. They followed me. The night my uncle died in our kitchen window, I thought the horror had reached its peak. But that was the beginning. My mother's mind split like rotten wood. She saw ghosts where there were none, and failed to see the monster she was becoming. Our home filled with strangers, filth, and things so vile they don't belong in human memory. She smeared her madness across our walls, our floors, our lives. I slept with a lock on my door, listening to her wander the hall like something not entirely human anymore. This isn't just a story about losing a mother. It's about losing yourself. One night at a time. In a house that refused to let you go. You don't escape places like that. You survive them. And the darkness? It follows. Some stories don't begin with thunder. Sometimes they begin with a house that breathes. The place where I grew up was a 2-story wooden building standing on sagging legs, as if exhausted by all the lives that passed through it. The walls creaked like ribs under pressure. The floor sighed at night. And the staircase groaned like an old man who had seen too much. When I was a kid, I thought all houses were like that. I thought every doorframe had memories, every hallway had secrets, and every shadow carried someone's name. I didn't know ours was different, not because it was haunted, but because it had absorbed too many tragedies to stay silent. Back then life felt simple. Kids shouted in the yard, throwing stones, teasing each other, inventing wars between imaginary kingdoms. The air smelled of wet earth and old firewood. Nobody locked their doors, nobody feared the dark. I remember the boy from the next apartment, the one who teased me every day. A loud, restless kid, always laughing, always challenging everyone. One afternoon he disappeared behind a metal shield, yelling insults I no longer remember. I grabbed a chunk of brick, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because anger lit up inside me like a fuse. I threw it. A stupid, childish throw. But it hit him. Hard. He fell, the others screamed, adults rushed out. He lived, but the shock carved itself into my memory. It was the first quiet whisper from the house. Nothing here is as safe as you think. But that incident was nothing compared to what happened inside our own family. My uncle, my mother's brother, used to be one of the brightest lights in my childhood. He smelled like tobacco and warm evenings, lifted me onto his shoulders, and laughed with the kind of joy adults forget too quickly. Then alcohol hollowed him out. It stole the softness first. Then the humor. Then the humanity. He sank deeper every month, drinking whatever burned the throat. Eventually he lost the ability to distinguish hunger from thirst, family from strangers, love from rage. He wandered into our apartment like a starving shadow, eating from the pan with his bare hands. My parents locked the kitchen. He tried breaking in. The night everything changed started like any other. The house was quiet, too quiet. Only the wind scraped the window frames, searching for a way in. My mother told me later she was in the kitchen, alone, cutting something for dinner. Then she heard a scraping sound at the window. A desperate, animal sound, half breath, half growl. My uncle tried climbing through the small ventilation window, forcing his head and shoulders inside, his eyes wild, his hunger louder than his mind. My mother froze. He was violent when drunk. Unpredictable. She was trapped with nowhere to run. Fear decided for her. She grabbed a knife. And when he shoved his head through the opening, she stabbed him in the throat. He collapsed immediately, half inside, half outside the house, blood spilling down the frame. They didn't tell me the truth. They said he died in a hospital fight. For years I believed it. But the house. The house knew what really happened. It absorbed the scream that never came out. It swallowed the silence afterward. And from that night, something in the air changed forever. What none of us understood back then was that my uncle's death wasn't the end. It was the beginning, the moment when my mother's mind, already cracked by fear, finally shattered. Her decline didn't creep in quietly. It crashed through her life like a storm that refused to leave. First she insisted my father wasn't my father. She said he had been replaced by an identical twin, someone with a different name, different eyes, a different soul. And I, a child, believed her at first. Not because it made sense, but because madness spoken confidently can sound like truth. She drew words on the walls. She wandered the corridors whispering to herself. She pushed furniture around at night, creating new worlds built from chaos. Little by little, our home stopped being a home. It became hers, a maze of delusion, fear, and confusion that only she understood. And I didn't know it then. But this was just the beginning of the nightmare. My mother's unraveling didn't happen in whispers. It happened in declarations, loud, frantic, absolute. One morning she woke up and insisted my father's eyes were different. The day before they were brown, she said. Today they were green. She called him by another man's name, Dima, and refused to believe otherwise. I watched my father try to smile through the confusion, then through the fear, and finally through the heartbreak of realizing the woman he loved no longer recognized him, not truly, not consistently, not safely. Their arguments became thunder in the small wooden house. She accused him of conspiring, switching places, watching her sleep. He begged her to see reality. She refused. Eventually, he packed his things and left. Not because he wanted to abandon us, but because he finally understood that staying would destroy him. The day he walked out, the house exhaled a long, heavy breath, as if relieved or grieving, I still can't tell which. What followed was a descent so slow and yet so relentless that it almost felt like the house itself was rotting from the inside. My mother began writing on the walls in large, frantic letters. "Vaja, come back." The words spread like mold, across the hallway, the living room, even the door frames. Sometimes she would stand in front of the writing for hours, tracing the letters with her finger, whispering to someone only she could see. She started bringing strangers home, unstable, broken men who drifted through life like ghosts. One of them looked 40 but behaved like a child, throwing tantrums when denied alcohol. Another was a homeless man she picked up out of pity or delusion, who tried to assert dominance in our house. There were nights when shouting echoed through the hallway, fists hit walls, and I sat behind a locked door, counting heartbeats and praying the house didn't swallow me whole. But the strangest things began with food. My mother started making meals from anything she could find, rotten vegetables, moldy potatoes, expired cans. She boiled them into shapeless soups that smelled like decay. Sometimes she ate them. Sometimes she fed them to the men she brought home. Sometimes she left the pot sitting for days, letting flies claim them. People outside began to notice. The neighbors complained about the smell. They whispered about her behavior. Some were afraid of her. Some pitied her. But nobody knew what to do. There were moments when she would walk outside and cough deliberately in people's faces, especially if they coughed first. Like she was responding. Like it was a challenge. And then came the alien stories. She told everyone who would listen that extraterrestrials had stolen her unborn child. She described the spaceship in vivid detail, the bright light, the voices. But the truth was simpler and sadder. Long ago she had a benign tumor that prevented her from having more children. Her grief had twisted into fantasy. Her fantasy had twisted into madness. Inside the house, things grew worse. Trash piled up faster than I could clear it. Broken furniture, newspapers, bottles, rags, everything she touched became part of a growing mountain. The place that once felt too small now felt like a suffocating cavern filled with the debris of her mind. To reach my room, I had to force a narrow path through a 10-meter stretch of garbage. A single meter belonged to me. 9 belonged to the chaos. Eventually she fixated on wood, planks, boards, frames, broken chairs. She dragged them home like treasures. She built a strange elevated floor in my room, 30 or 40 centimeters high, uneven and impossible to walk on. I woke up one morning unable to take a single step without tripping. She called it her project. I called it a prison. By then, the neighbors had endured enough. The yard outside filled with her wooden hoard, a towering, unstable structure of old frames and rotting boards. It grew so large it reached the windows. They filed a petition. And one afternoon, the mayor himself arrived, a man in a neat coat standing in the yard of a house collapsing under the weight of someone's mind. Their conversation didn't last long. Whatever he saw in her eyes convinced him that this wasn't a matter of neighborhood complaints anymore. He called an ambulance. For a brief moment, after they took her to the hospital, the house grew quiet. Lighter. I thought it was over. I thought she would come back healed. But I didn't know then that we had only survived the first storm. The weeks after my mother was taken to the hospital felt like standing inside a paused world. The house didn't breathe, didn't groan, didn't whisper. For the first time in years, it felt empty. I remember waking up the next morning and realizing I could actually hear my own footsteps. The floor was no longer muffled by heaps of trash. The air didn't have that sour heaviness that clung to everything. I could walk through the hallway without having to turn sideways. For a moment, I thought we had escaped. But storms don't disappear, they circle back. When my mother returned, she was quiet. Too quiet. Not healed, just temporarily dulled by medication and routine. She walked through the rooms like someone exploring a place she used to live in but no longer recognized. For a few days, I allowed myself to imagine a version of reality where everything could go back to normal. But then the old patterns began to scratch their way back into her bones. She stopped taking her medicine. Her thoughts sharpened in the wrong direction. Her eyes lost focus but gained intensity, that frightening combination of emptiness and purpose. The hoarding started again. It began small: newspapers, glass jars, scraps of cloth she found outside. Then came plastic bags, bottles, forgotten toys. Things that belonged in the trash but somehow became sacred to her. Every object had meaning. Every piece had a story she insisted she needed to protect. The smell returned first. Then the clutter. Then the chaos. But the next stage was worse, far worse. She began collecting feces. Not as a symptom of sadness. Not as some strange joke. But as a weapon. She smeared it on neighbors' firewood. She packed it into bags and carried it with her on buses to the dacha. I could only imagine the horror of anyone sitting near her. The day she smeared the bathroom door with it, after I brought a girl home, I didn't feel anger. I felt a quiet collapse inside me. A realization that whatever part of her mind still remained had finally dissolved. I confronted her, but she lied straight to my face with childlike stubbornness. It wasn't me. As if the smell itself wasn't screaming the truth. I stopped bringing friends over. I stopped answering questions from neighbors. I stopped hoping she could return to the person she once was. Instead, I focused on survival. My room became my last refuge. I installed a lock, not to keep burglars out, but to protect myself from my own mother. Every time I came home from the university, I found new junk shoved into my space: broken boards, random fabrics, objects she dragged off the street. She tried to rebuild that raised wooden floor again in my room, as if the first time hadn't been enough of a nightmare. It took hours to dismantle. Hours to reclaim my space. Hours to remind myself that I was not going to drown in her world. Meanwhile, the outside yard transformed into a battleground. Her obsession with collecting wood turned into an avalanche of debris around our house. She built enormous piles, stacked windows, broken chairs, random boards, forming a fortress of trash so tall it blocked sunlight. Neighbors hated it. Feared it. Some treated her with silent disgust. Others tried to help. None succeeded. And I, somewhere between a teenager and a young adult, felt like I was living in a sinking ship while everyone else stood on the shore watching, unable to reach me. That's when a neighbor, kinder than most, offered her a place to stay. Maybe he thought he could help her. Maybe he pitied her. Maybe he thought she was harmless. She moved into his house. Not just for a week. For months. For years. And our house finally went silent. But by then, the silence felt like a ghost itself, one that lingered long after she was gone. The house was finally quiet, but quiet didn't mean peaceful. It meant exposed. Without my mother's chaos filling every corner, the walls seemed naked, stripped of the noise that once hid the truth. Every stain, every crack, every patch of warped wood felt like a scar the house had been trying to cover for years. And for the first time, I noticed how damaged I was too. Silence can be cruel when you've spent your whole life drowning in noise. I remember one evening sitting alone at the kitchen table, the same place where everything had started, where my uncle had died. The room was almost normal again, but I wasn't. The light bulb buzzed above me, steady and soft, and for a moment I felt like a child again, wishing the chaos would come back, simply because the chaos was familiar. But it didn't. It never would. My father returned sometimes. Not to stay, just to help. He and I cleared the yard together, piece by piece. Rotten planks. Broken frames. Moldy cushions. Rusted nails. We dismantled monuments she had built out of madness. Sometimes we found things that made us stop. A broken toy from my childhood. A cooking pot we thought we had lost. A coat that belonged to my grandmother. Every item felt like a message from a time before everything fell apart. Inside the house, the work was even harder. We filled dozens of bags with trash. We scrubbed walls that still echoed with my mother's frantic handwriting. We opened windows to let air in and trauma out, if that were possible. But the deeper we cleaned, the deeper the memories cut. I realized I had spent so many years fighting to protect my little corner of the world that I never allowed myself to feel anything. Survival leaves no space for reflection. When the danger finally leaves, the emotions come back like a flood. And with them came the question I had avoided my entire life. Was any of this my fault? Not logically, but emotionally. Children blame themselves for storms they didn't cause. If I hadn't thrown that brick. If my uncle hadn't spiraled. If my mother hadn't been alone that night. If my father hadn't left. If I had been older, stronger, wiser. But houses don't break because of children. Minds don't collapse from a single moment. Chaos doesn't grow from one seed, it grows from dozens, watered quietly over the years until one day it explodes into daylight. And yet guilt is stubborn. It clings like dust in old wood, even after you've cleaned everything else. One of the hardest days came when I entered my mother's old room. It was the epicenter of everything, the place where she whispered to people who weren't there, where she hid her collections, where she barricaded herself during her worst moments. The smell hit me first. Old air. Damp fabric. Something metallic. Something forgotten. The walls were covered with drawings and notes. Some were prayers. Some were warnings. Some were just scribbles that made no sense to anyone except her. On one wall, in shaky handwriting, she had written, "Don't let the house swallow him." I stared at those words for a long time. Did she mean me? Did she know she was losing control? Was this a moment of clarity breaking through the madness? I'll never know. Cleaning that room felt like trying to clean the inside of a wound. But I did it. My father did it with me. Bag by bag, hour by hour, memory by memory, we reclaimed the space she had drowned in her illness. And slowly, painfully, the house began to feel livable again. Safe, not in a joyful way, but in a way that no longer threatened to crush me. But even as life slowly returned to normal, a shadow remained, not from the past, but from the future. Because deep down, I knew my mother wasn't done with us. Madness doesn't disappear. It waits. And sooner or later, it finds a way back. I always thought the end of the story would come when my mother left the house. When the chaos finally stopped. When the shouting turned to silence, and the floors stopped shaking under the weight of her madness. But endings aren't that simple. They don't arrive in clean lines. They bleed into you slowly, like water seeping into old wood. For months after she moved into the neighbor's house, I lived in a strange balance between relief and dread. The relief was easy to understand. For the first time in years, I could sleep. I could breathe. I could bring water into the house without stepping over mountains of trash or worrying what new nightmare would greet me that evening. But the dread. That was harder. Every time I walked past her old room, I felt the ghost of her presence behind the door, as if the walls still remembered her footsteps. Every time I passed the yard, the dirt seemed to whisper her name. Every time a shadow moved slightly wrong, I wondered if she would return, carrying a new storm behind her. People like my mother don't just vanish. Their absence becomes another kind of presence. The neighbor who took her in was kind, but I often wondered how long his kindness would last. How many nights he'd endure before realizing he had invited a hurricane into his home. Despite everything she had done, there were moments, brief, sharp, painful, when I missed her. Not the woman she became, but the woman she used to be. The one who held my hand on cold mornings. Who braided my hair, or tried to. Who laughed like someone who still believed in the future. Losing a person to madness is a slow death. It doesn't happen once. It happens hundreds of times. In every moment you see the familiar vanish and something unrecognizable takes its place. One day, months after she left, I walked past the window and saw her outside in the yard. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to come back. But there she was, digging through the remnants of the wooden pile we hadn't cleared yet. She looked up at me. For a second, just 1 second, I saw clarity in her eyes. Something human. Something real. Something like the mother I once knew. She raised her hand in a small wave. I lifted mine in return. And then, like a flame blown out by the wind, that moment disappeared. Her eyes changed. She muttered something to herself and went back to rummaging through the wood. I watched her until she left the yard. And I understood something I wasn't ready to accept before. You cannot save someone who has sunk their mind into darkness. You can only survive them. Over time, life moved on, not forward, not upward, just onward. I studied, worked, built routines. The house became livable. The memories became quieter, though never silent. The neighbors learned to stop asking questions. My father and I rebuilt what we could. But trauma has a strange way of settling into your bones like dust. You don't see it every day, but you feel it every time you breathe. Even now, years later, there are moments when I wake up at night thinking I hear her knocking on the door. Moments when a creak in the floor feels like the house remembering her footsteps. Moments when the smell of damp wood takes me back to a childhood that feels both distant and unbearably close. I don't hate her. And I don't love her in the simple way people love their parents. I love the version of her that existed before the madness. And I mourn the version that never came back. People say you should love your family no matter what. But I learned something they don't teach you in stories. Love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes love means surviving. Sometimes love means letting go. The house no longer breathes the way it used to. The walls no longer whisper. The shadows no longer follow me. But if you listen closely, very closely, you can still hear a faint echo. Not the madness. Not the screams. Not the chaos. But the heartbeat of a child who tried to grow up in a collapsing world. And walked out of it alive. And that is the closest thing to a happy ending this story will ever have.